Welcome back, witches and bitches. We are here again for another wild episode of Beyond Dimensional. We are your hosts. I'm Liz.
I'm Lori.
And we are joined today by a truly amazing human. Her name is Melissa Kim Corter. She is a highly experienced depth psychologist. She works in the spaces of the subconscious mind in what many people call shadow work. Melissa's gift help her uncover and dig deep with her clients to reveal what lies beneath the surface. She's the author of the Wild Woman book trilogy and host of her own podcast, A Dose of Depth. Melissa is a true detective of the subliminal and healer of the undiscovered. Welcome, Melissa. Thank you so much for jumping on your broomstick with us today.
Yes,
Oh
welcome.
my gosh. I'm so excited to be here. That was amazing. Thank you for all of that. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's me. That's so incredible.
Oh, I'm so happy that my mushy brain today could help to truly give you the intro you deserve. And that's barely scratching the surface, to be totally honest. Considering what you do, scratching the surface is like your specialty here, digging beneath. And I know you're way into your journey of what you do. So, there's so much we can get into. I mean, just before we jumped on, everybody, we were talking already about how many more episodes we need to record with Melissa. So this is going to be truly just a dipping our toes into the pool of Melissa Kim Corter. So give us a Cliff Notes version of your origin story.
Oh my gosh, the story, it all begins, in the story. I was a weird kid. I like to just start there right off the bat. I was a weird kid, like all the weird stuff. I had this natural curiosity that seemed to make other people uncomfortable. It usually involved, psychological thrillers and these really bizarre sort of things. And I was drawn to just the darker things and people and situations. I used to kind of like play these different games where it shows some of these curiosities and where they kind of began. But one of the games I would play is just flipping over stone in the wood. And I would have this feeling of fear, sort of like, what am I going to find? What if it's a snake or something terrifying? But at the same time, there was this other feeling that was like exhilaration, excitement. Like, what if it's something cool, like gold coins or a bunny, something else? And there's a thing about the duality.
Under this rock.
Under a rock, right? It's like now your little mind works. But the curiosity was something that comes with shadow in itself, which I'll kind of describe. But I always sort of followed that impulse, whether it was the way that I navigated the world or even conversation. I just remember being really young and somehow ending up in the middle of like a restroom and like the bathroom of a restaurant or something, and strangers just coming in and telling me their life stories. And I'm like 7, washing my hands, and they're telling me things. So it's just this weird sort of energy that I had that actually made people feel very safe. And at the same time, I felt very misunderstood. So from a young age, I was deeply sensitive. Like a lot of us, were just kind of drawn to explore these hidden worlds. We can't quite see them, but we have this sense that there's something more than who we are. And so it really began in those moments. And there was some intense conflict and trauma and a lot of other things as well that sort of heightened that intuition. So part of it was a little bit of an internal sort of quest of like, who am I? Why do I feel so different from other people? Why am I weird? How come they're not into this stuff? Like, is anybody else playing Bloody Mary in the mirror with the neighborhood kids and getting scared? And right? Like, I know they're out there. I know we're out there. But when you kind of feel alone in that, it's very, it starts to kind of suppress that curiosity a little bit. It started strong. I was connected to nature. That's where I felt at home. I'd go in the woods and play these strange games. And ultimately, it was a way of fitting in. I didn't know this at the time, but it's where I felt like I belonged. And I really had this instinctual, intuitive connection with the natural world. But I also learned early on in all of this that there were, the world wasn't always the most friendliest of places. And I also had that kind of knowing early on, like at a super young age. And I think it's why I was drawn to those movies, because it sort of gave the not reality, but it painted the picture of like, oh, everything isn't like rainbows and, like unicorns. And even though that's kind of like a strange thing to think about, it brought me comfort because I felt like there was something honest kind of being conveyed in the intensity of graphic things, death and murder, and these topics that would scare people. And just to be clear, it wasn't this, I wasn't glorifying those things or focusing on the horror of what was being done in a way where I was drawn to it for that purpose. It was more like, wow, why do people go off the rails? Like, why do they do these things?
Totally.
What's going on? So that curiosity was there from like just day one. And it led me into some beautiful things. And it also led me into some dangerous territory. But I think that's really the beginning, is seeing how I kind of traced it through my life and the doors that it opened and the places.
I first have to say, I'm just thinking when you mentioned, you were the weird kid, and Lori's like, me, I was doing Bloody Mary too. Firstly, that terrified the shit out of me because I think I secretly, I actually believe that is a real thing.
Right?
But
I did
imagine,
too.
right?
I thought
But
it was real, but I'm like, bring it, bitch. Let's go. I'm not afraid. Let's do this.
You're like,
Right?
I will
Right.
take you on, Mary.
Let's do it.
Go.
Bloody nothing.
Smash that mirror.
Right? You're like, let's go, bitch. Like, you were ready to go.
She never showed up for me, so I think I ruined it by saying that. But anyway, sorry, Liz.
There was
carry
no
on.
overcompensating by any,
Yeah.
whatever. But I'm just imagining, as an adult, thinking back and being able to, if we could go back in time with all the people that we've collected as adults who have had the similar experience, I'm just imagining all of us being able to be in elementary school together and be like, we're all believers. Like, we all know, like, to go back to what you know now, it would have been so fun. Like, imagine we were all in like a little gang group together, actually summoning bloody.
Well,
and then she'd show up.
It's like the group over there that watches the Care Bears and our group that watches Poltergeist. We're like, listen,
Exactly.
we're over here with the scary shit. If you want unicorns and Care Bears and all that butterfly business, go to that group. This is our
That's
own
right.
group, right? Instead, we were the weirdos. Of course, I've always been weird. Not even when I was a kid. I'm still a fucking weirdo. But, that's a whole other story. Anyway, yeah, Liz, I'm sorry. I cut you off as per usual.
That was really it. I had a thought and I just wanted to word vomit out to everybody. But yeah, I what you do is so fascinating. So it sounds like you had this intense, kind of, I use this term lightly or heavily, but calling to the like different dimensions of the human experience. You were like, it's nice that we're all in rainbow land over here, but really, like, the deep shit is beyond that level, right? You pull back that layer and like, what are we doing in there? Like, how does the brain work?
Yeah.
So did you end up studying psychology first, or, because your intuitive self was a little bit, dampened by, the life as it happens? How did you progress into this?
Oh, it's such a good question. There was a lot of really bizarre little intersections that kind of brought me along the way. But I had shut down my intuition. It was still there, but it was very much something I dismissed, kind of ignored. So there was a chunk of time where I was also involved with like just partying and substances and like, just dampening all of that. I didn't want to feel, I didn't want to hear things. I didn't want to see things because it made me feel different than people, around me. So there was that whole thing. But the thing that kind of started leading me more on the route of making sense of these things is my husband and I just moved across the country, just picked up and left. We were living in New York, and we're like, this is difficult, upstate New York. And we're like, let's just go out west. He had some family out there. Anyhow, it was a huge life-changing experience. But what it did is it made me go, okay, what do I want to do with myself? I got to figure something out. We were struggling. We didn't have a lot of money. I had my son a month after we moved across the country because I didn't know I was going to have him early. So all these weird things happened. And ultimately I discovered, actually my husband found this brochure, came in the mail. And he's like, I don't know why, but you might want to check this out. There's all these really cool like modalities, like all these like massage therapy and hypnotherapy. And they did all this stuff. And I was like, let me just check this out. Anyway, I ended up enrolling in this school. what happened is I really believe the things that we try to push down come back around in different forms. Usually they are trying to help us. It isn't as scary as it sounds. These things that we push down are meant to be processed and moved through, but we suppress, we push it down. So I had been doing that. And so here I enter into this school and I'm thinking, I'm going to be a massage therapist. I'm going to just, work on the body and muscles and help people feel better. Well, as soon as I started getting into that work, my senses opened right back up. I would start massaging people and I would get little images of scenes playing out in my mind. I would see lights around the body and I realized, like small, tiny little lights. And I realized if I followed those lights, that is where there was pain or stagnation in their body. And they would be like, why did you spend so much time on my right hip? I forgot to tell you that I had this whatever thing. And I just noticed you spent a lot of time. And I would be like, I'd play dumb and be like, well, I don't know. But I didn't realize this was honing something in me. This was really building up that instinct, that intuition. And then what I was seeing in my mind's eye was sort of validating and giving it some more context so I could relate it to the client. So what was going on is I'm paying attention to the lights around the body. I'm sensing that, I'm getting the story, and then I'm putting it together. And they're going, I just thought I had a busted knee. And then they're telling me this whole story of like, when I was 6, this thing happened. And I'm like, well, here's what I'm seeing. And then the pain in the body would subside. It was so amazing. And what I now realized was going on is it was tapping into a story because the body was holding it for them to be realized, something they were pushing down or unaware of. That was really the first door where I went, I don't know how this is happening, but it reminded me of how I also didn't know what was happening as a child. But now I'm an adult. I'm surrounded by other weirdos because this school was like Hogwarts. So there's like a whole bunch of us, kind of like what you were describing. And I just started tracing it. And what happened is I realized I don't want to work with the body. I'm loving this part of getting these inner images, conveying what I'm sensing, feeling. It's connecting for the client and it was helping. And so I shifted gears completely from body to mind. Now, at the same time, I thought I was going to become a forensic pathologist or a profiler with the FBI. I really wanted to work with the mind. I wanted to hunt dangerous people. I wanted to be a part of that process of figuring these things out. But my life took a turn in a way where when I had my son, I was like, there's no way I could be in that world. All of a sudden, this fear of like, no way, I can't have a child and subject myself to that stuff. So what happened though, is that desire to do those things came around in such a radically different way in work. And I followed my intuition the entire way. It brought through the gifts, the skills, the talents, the knowledge, the insight from different classes, mentors, people. And so here I am just going, wow, the parts of things I thought I had to let go of and I wasn't able to do came through in such a radically different creative way where I actually enjoy it. I can work with it without putting my life in danger or at risk, without my family being subjected to terrible things. And I can consciously choose how I engage with that material now. So it's just kind of funny how like we think we're making these decisions, but what I really ultimately see now is how it's almost like something pulling me through every single point and saying, and now you're here and now you'll learn this. And now you're going to face this thing, this moment, this whatever. And ultimately that led me to study the type of psychology that I'm into, shadow and all these other things. But there's moments where you do it kicking and screaming. You're not willingly saying, oh, this is great. I want to be here. It's like, what the hell am I doing here? Why is this? And that's often evidence that there's something going on there that we need to learn or grow through or move through. But yeah, it's been an interesting, crazy path. It certainly has not been a straight linear process. It's been a little bit of a shit show, if I can say that.
Yep.
But I wouldn't have it any other way. I love the shit show of my life. It helps a lot of people. So it's, pretty good.
It's amazing. I mean, you could have been like the Criminal Minds episodes, the profiler, going to killers. I totally get what you're saying. Once you become a parent, things really do change and your priorities shift. And then that worrying about physical danger happens. So shadow work. So we definitely want to talk about that. And I'm going to just put it out there. I've been terrified of shadow work. I've been told by so many witches, mediums, people reading me like, man, Lori, there's so much shadow work for you. You got to get on that. This is your time. Work on the shadow work. I'm like, okay, what the hell does that mean? And it usually connects to some creepy entity hiding in my closet in the middle of the night that's there to tell me about myself and, creepy shit that I just don't want to deal with. When we talk to you, your explanation of it and really an understanding of like, that's the movie part. That's not what this is. So tell us a little bit about that. When we say helping someone do the work, the shadow work, what does that mean? And how do you do that in your practice?
I love this question because I've encountered so much of the misconceptions, the information that's out there on shadow. And I think that there's so much confusion around the term. And even just from the beginning, just starting with the word shadow in general, it is ominous. It's kind of like, what? That's dark. I don't know how to feel about it. It's right. Like we almost instinctually want to literalize it right out the gate before we even kind of know. So it's natural for a lot of us to feel hesitant or unsure or even unsafe to explore that. What I love about shadow work is, first of all, just to distinguish it a little bit, I'm trained in Jungian archetypal studies and shadow work, which basically is the origin of the term and the terminology. Mm-hmm. So it really starts with Carl Jung, who was a Swiss psychologist and psychoanalyst. And he actually coined the term the shadow self. And the traditional studies, I'm very dedicated to really tracing the origins of this because it keeps the integrity of what it was meant to be. And it does help clarify some of these sort of things. So that's where it began, where he believed that there was this part of us that was beneath conscious awareness. Wasn't good, wasn't bad, but it was just something we couldn't quite see or grab a hold of. But we know it's there because we feel it. So he called this the shadow self. Now, along with this, there are multiple layers. So we work with something that's called a framework of the psyche. And the psyche is the Greek word for soul. And essentially, this framework of the psyche has different layers and parts to it. They all interact with each other. They are all working in a way that's harmonious, that's actually working on our behalf. So it's a part of us that really wants to be in a state of balance. And so the shadow is a part of that, but it is the part of it that is beneath consciousness. So the way I like to explain it to my clients and students is imagine that you have a flashlight and you're holding up that flashlight. You're going to get a pretty strong beam, and the beam is going to be focused on one thing, right? It's hard to kind of like see what else is in the space or what else is in the room. If you're in the dark, got a flashlight, you're really laser focused on one thing. That part of us is called the ego. And so the ego is really responsible for the type of information that flows into our awareness and the type of information that isn't allowed to come into our awareness, pushed down. Consciously, when we push it down, we are suppressing. Automatically, when we push it down through the psyche doing it on our behalf, we're repressing. And this is important because this flow of energy happens all the time. It's always this continuous movement of information that's rising up and then falling back down into the unconscious. The unconscious is really the part of us that is also beneath our awareness. And the shadow kind of shares that territory of the unconscious. So the way I like people to think of it is, don't think of the shadow as this thing that's against you or doing things to you. Think of the shadow as more of a field that is like a container. And this container isn't good, isn't bad, but it's a part of us that is holding things. It's holding the things that the ego, that flashlight, can't see. And so what happens is when we work on the shadow and when we work simultaneously on shadow and the ego, and there's different ways that you do that creatively and things like that. But what you're really doing is you're building the tolerance of the ego so that it can shift from being this flashlight to more of a dimmer switch. And the dimmer switch allows more. We get to see a little more. We sense a little more. We feel a little more. It's like when you have those moments, an aha moment, or all of a sudden you have an insight and you're like, oh my gosh, it's been in front of me the whole time. Why did I never think of that? That's a dimmer switch moment. That's when your ego said, for whatever reason, it's safe for me to see this now, or to witness this or experience it. It's not protecting you from whatever that was, because really that's what it does, is it thinks it's protecting you from perceived threats. So the shadow in itself is just kind of holding this space of those things. Now, what's in the shadow, there's lots of layers to this too, but the quick sort of like, the easiest way to describe it is the things. So the ego is very much connected to how we fit into the world. Okay. And it sort of cares about our roles, our identity, how we show up, what's acceptable, what's okay for us to do, how we're supposed to act and behave. It's kind of governing all of that. And then what it does is it shows all of that through our persona. The persona is the outermost part that faces the world. So the deeper we go with these layers, the more we get into the deeper self, we get into the shadow, we get into the territory that's just more unknown. And so when the ego says, oh, well, that's not acceptable, we can't say that, we can't do that thing, we can't act this way, even though there's like this deeper impulse that's like, just be wild and weird. It would be so fun to be that way. But then the ego is like, no, we'll be judged, we'll be criticized. So what it does is it just pushes those impulses, those desires right back down. But then what happens is this deeper part, which we could call the soul, the true self, goes, but I want to live authentically. I want to express myself. I want to not just fit into the world, but like create my world. I want to like live this life full out. So what happens is the ego starts shifting its orientation from the outer world to the inner world. That's a part of shadow work, is just confronting ourselves, our desires. How are we hiding? Are we showing up fully? Are we abandoning ourselves? Are we contradicting ourselves? And it's not about shame or judgment or being harsh about our patterns and cycles. It's actually the opposite. If we can become very curious about why we behave the way we do, what we do, we're actually doing shadow work. We're asking deeper questions to reveal more information, to gain clarity or insight. So I like to remove the fear of shadow and just say, it isn't that everything in shadow is always lovely and wonderful. Because sure, we have painful moments, we have trauma, I call them impactful moments as well. And if something was too much, too overwhelming for us to process, right, that's considered often a trauma, a lot of things get pushed into the shadow, into the unconscious. But again, not to hurt us, but until at a later time when we're more equipped to deal with it, whether that's the right person helping us or a situation or something unlocks it within the body. So the shadow is really doing this beautiful thing of containing all of that for us. It's not actively trying to hurt us. It's not as frightening as a lot of people think, but because it's unknown, because we can't point at it, locate it, we get really uncomfortable when things are sort of ominous and the mind can't like say, that's it right there. The mind doesn't like anything that's ambiguous. It likes to solve problems and fill in the gaps. And the shadow's like, no, that's not going to happen here.
It's protecting, right? The ego's job is to protect us, whatever that looks like individually. Would you see, when you talk to people and say, I can't remember my childhood, or I can't remember the first 5 years of my childhood, is that often a big part of that? It's like likely some trauma happened, something that the person's not really ready to handle, and that's part of what needs to come out through shadow work.
Sometimes, but it's actually kind of interesting. And this is just my personal experience and opinion. So it might vary for people. Honestly, a lot of that is boredom. There's times in our life where nothing's happening. There's just literally times when you're a child and you're kind of like, am I going to remember sitting on this baseball field looking at the sky? Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. So sometimes it's like, it can be like that too, where there's just periods of time where maybe things were great. Maybe things were good too, or they're kind of like blank spots in a way, because there's no heightened emotion. There's nothing for the mind to hold on to and go, that could be a threat later. We need to remember this forever. So I noticed that children or adults who daydreamed a lot or spent a lot of time alone, they can sometimes feel this nervous fear, like is there something buried within me that I'm going to discover one day, like ripping off a Band-Aid because I don't remember chunks of time. And I like to assure them that some of those chunks of time are simply because you might have been bored, because there wasn't a threat, because there's a million things your brain's trying to hold on in memory, and it's going to go with the essentials. It's not going to go with a random Tuesday where nothing out of the ordinary happened. It's going to kind of dump some of that information and hold on to these other significant. So it can be a combination. And of course, then there are times when there's people who have had extreme situations where chunks of time are pushed down and repressed and suppressed depending on the situation. But I like to say that too, because I feel like sometimes that little detail sets people at ease to go, oh. Yeah. And the way that I tell them to kind of trust that is like, if you hear something and there's a resonance there, usually that's your body, that's shadow too, saying, pay attention to this, because our resonance is one of the best ways we can listen to our intuitive guidance on something. If we don't have recall, if we don't have the memory to say, I can identify that moment, part of shadow work is paying attention to what you can't see, what you don't know to be true, what is invisible. And there are moments where the shadow does kind of, I said it's like neutral and not really good or bad, but there are moments where it works on your behalf too, where like, let's say something happens and you're a people pleaser and you're a very calm, grounded person, but you're a people pleaser, or you don't tend to kind of like get bent out of shape or, freak out on people. And all of a sudden one day, something's going on and somebody just says the wrong thing or is trying to take advantage, and you hear yourself say something crazy. Like you just maybe put somebody in their place, or you do something that feels out of character, but it worked for you, like worked on your behalf. Like, oh my gosh, that felt really good. I've never done that before. And I needed to hold that boundary or whatever. That's the shadow working on behalf. It's this deeper impulse of this part of us that's like, hey, I want to create boundaries. I want to be more confident. But if we're out of touch with those qualities, if we just haven't embodied them yet, that's also in shadow. So every time you want to finish something new, add a new layer to your identity or personality, all of that starts in dark. It's invisible light. It comes from shadow first, not because it's bad or evil, but simply because it's not integrated. It hasn't been worked with. It's kind of the same thing as flipping over the stone, right? It's not wrong or bad. It's just, hey, there was something under there that we hadn't really worked with, seen before, experienced. It's unknown. But in our society, we like to look at things unknown and go, that's bad. That's evil because I don't understand it, or it's different than what I was taught.
Yeah.
So shadow work also helps us build tolerance and compassion, and really rely on instinct from a grounded intuition versus I'm scared, therefore this must not be in alignment for me. And it's like, or maybe you're just scared, right? Like we start asking different questions.
Completely.
When we work
Completely.
Well, I've first of all, never felt more seen, because you were just describing my human experience. And I've never been more fascinated. I feel like I should be in a lecture hall right now, like in Psych 101, like taking notes, because I'm just enthralled by this conversation. But the other one is that now I'm just thinking, but Peter Pan and the whole shadow thing, and Carl Jung, and like the whole staying young and wanting to be a kid, I was like, I feel like there's something in that.
And I love, Liz, your point of like, wow, okay. It kind of connects. Now I feel like my ADHD in my dream world is probably why I can't remember half the shit that happened to me when I was a kid. You can send me the bill. Feel like, Liz, I'll pay your half. I feel like it was very...
Lori, are you kidding? I'm about to go book Josh in for a full year of this, my husband. I'm straight up, bro, you're going tomorrow?
Me too. I'm about to sign up too.
Have like a private retreat. We need to do like a deep, like full long weekend, like just crew.
Yeah,
we have
totally. Really, the shadow work thing is always, like I said, been perceived by me, and not that so many people have told me. Some have implied, sure, and there's like, certain people that like to make it into their own thing, right, for their own purposes. Yeah. But having that understanding makes so much sense. And I think as we look at the things in our life that we're uncomfortable with and that we do knowingly, not even the stuff that we do without even consciously being aware, but the stuff that we push down knowingly. Think about, throughout your life where you've gone, I don't want to deal with that, so that's not going to be a thing. And it's just like, okay, that goes in the other closet. that other bullshit closet we're never going to sort out. So we'll just keep filling it until the door pops open. So anyway, I don't know where I was going with that, but that is exactly what it reminds me of. There's also another story you told us that I love and am super fascinated by, and it had to do with a client that thought she was possessed.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely want to hear more about that story. And I think that's super related to the last thing I wanted to make sure we cover with Melissa is, so many people talk, like we refer to shadow work, like we were talking about, like, is this like evil, demonic possession situation in like this very spiritual sense? And you just gave us a super, like, highly scientific, psychological aspect to it. But I know that your work, like when you go take a look at your web pages and your Substacks and things, it gears a little bit more towards that spiritual side. So how do how does that blend in terms of like your clientele and how you emphasize your work? And I think this client story is going to be a great understanding of that.
Yeah. I think it's so important to share that, and maybe people feel this way or don't feel this way, but one of the things that I feel is I really think all of those things cross over. So even if it's psychological, even if it's spiritual, scientific, I really feel like there's through lines and interconnectivity that's happening. I've seen some really beautiful things unfold psychologically that had this numinous spiritual, undeniable aspect. And I'm like, how could we separate this spiritual thing from this psychological movement, right? So to me, they're very much interconnected. I think that's why this story I'll share, I think that's why I was able to kind of come about in that way. I think that if we're willing to be curious about these things and do our best to refrain from making judgments or assumptions, that's when I think we're kind of able to tap into deeper layers, psychologically, scientifically, spiritually, all of it. I really do. I think our willingness to just remain open and curious and wait till we kind of have information. Information can be very intuitive. It doesn't have to be just that linear, logical part of us, but it can be a felt sense, like a somatic reaction. And I weave all of that together because I don't think it's separate. So if my client's talking about something and I intuitively sense there's a shift in their voice, or I feel something in my body, it's not separate. I'll bring it into the session and say, hey, pause there for a moment. Did you just feel that? What was that? Is there something there, or am I projecting on you? Right? And we have this dialogue that feels like we're together versus I'm the therapist, professional on the pedestal person, and you're my client. And it's more like we're in this incubative space. That's what kind of sets the tone for these things to really unfold in this way. So this particular client story that you guys are talking about is, it's kind of interesting. This was early on in my career, actually. I want to say it's got to be at least 10 years ago now. So somewhat early in my career, where I had this client who was experiencing this really frightening thing. She was having these different things appear on her body, bruises, cuts, and scrapes and scratches and things like that. And she had gone to so many people, all different types. She had gone medical, spiritual, shamans, medicine people, like everything. She had tried so many different things. And then she was also shunned a lot. She was made sort of like, she felt like they treated her like she was crazy, making things up. But it was a very real experience. So I think the other thing too, before I kind of go into the deeper part of this, is when somebody comes to me with something, even if it's outside of the framework of my belief system, I remind myself that this is real for this person. May not be what I understand, may not be something I've ever encountered before, but on some level, it's real for them. That helps me go a little deeper, because otherwise, in full transparency, there's a part of me that goes, oh boy, here we go. Is this going to be blamed on a past life? Is this going to be blamed on something? But for this person, it felt to her very demonic. That was the language she used. That was sort of the way she described it. She felt haunted. She felt like whatever this was, that she couldn't see it, but it was manifesting physically in nightmares. And she would wake up and have these different physical things on the body. And she actually had one of her children started to have a similar thing too. So that's even cause for alarm.
Whoa.
Right. It's like anything that happens to us.
Terrifying. Yeah.
Yeah, to a degree, you can kind of deal with it. But then it's like you bring the kids into the mix. It's like, oh man, I got to get this figured out because
You're
this
like,
is
what am I fighting off, right? Bloody Mary's here.
exactly. It's like
Sometimes
taking the demons down. We got to figure
Yep.
this out. So yeah, so I listened. I listened to her, and I let her just really go into what she thought it was, how it affected her, how it affected her mental health, how it affected her safety in the world, impacted her sleep. Like there's all these different layers to it. I'll never forget there was just this moment because we had talked about this. It wasn't a one-time situation. It was kind of like it started as an ongoing thing where we had worked at it from a few different angles. I was also a certified hypnotherapist. And so we tried some regression work. We tried some different things. And it just, I couldn't figure it out. And I couldn't understand, like, what is this about? And for some reason, there was a part of me that was like, I'm not closed off to think that demons don't exist. But again, it wasn't a part of my framework of what I believed or something I understood at that from that level. But I just stayed open, kept working with her. And then there was this moment, I had this like intuitive sort of a realization or a feeling, an intuitive thing that kind of unfolded. And I just started asking her questions, which is interesting too. I feel like intuition, psyche, that part of us, the soulful part of the psyche, speaks to us in symbol. It's very symbolic. It's very poetic. We misinterpret that because we'll see that symbolism can be intense, can be graphic and disturbing and ugly and intense, all of it. But there was this curiosity that I kept I kept at it with the client. And I just started asking these questions. When did you first feel these things? When did they first kind of show up? And I ended up kind of feeling, so part of the way I work with people is I can actually feel into their nervous system a little bit is the way I describe it. I can sense things. I usually can sense an age or a time where something may have started. I usually get a little thing that plays out in my mind, kind of like I was describing when I first started massage therapy, the story kind of thing. Sometimes that happens. And that started happening with her. And I was seeing this man in my mind. And I wanted to keep coming back to asking her questions about her previous marriage. And so thankfully, she was willing to kind of go there. And what actually ended up unfolding from this is my intuition combined with her remembrance and recollection of these traumatic moments and events when she was extremely afraid. I'm talking fearful, fear for her life. It was a very abusive situation. And she ended up thankfully getting out of that marriage. But these things started after the marriage. So she actually got out of the marriage and then these things started, the physical manifestation of the bruise. So it was interesting. And for some reason, that detail stood out in my mind. I couldn't let it go. So sometimes the way my intuition also works is I kind of think we had this beautiful pit bull. Her name was Bella. And she was so sweet and so cute. But man, if she locked eyes on something, you were going to have to like break her out of that trance because she was going to go for it, usually like something like that. Anyway, I feel that same sort of like, if I sense something, I can't let the detail go. There's some part of me that's like, Melissa, stay with this, stay with it. And I did that. And I just kept going with this thing around the husband and this energy and this emotion. We ended up tapping into this well of what I call like unfinished business, right? In her nervous system, in her psyche. And there was this deep fear, deep trauma, deep fear that wasn't processed, that wasn't expressed. She went from the divorce to not really being able to grieve, having to take care of her children, living this life where she was on the go. And anyhow, the point is that she had suppressed so much of the fear and all of these things. So nightmares, our dream state, is one of the ways that it's not that we're just processing all of that, although that's a piece of it. It comes up because remember the ego, it's protecting us, but during the day, we're busy, we're distracted, we can push it down, but at night, those defenses aren't there. So part of what's going on is her conscious mind wasn't there to distract her, to defend her. And so these things were coming up. When I say things, feelings, symbols, emotions actually coming up. And she was having a physical somatic response to those repressed fears. When we made this connection, we weren't still sure, like, hey, is this the thing? Or is it possible that there is some demonic influence? I don't know, right? But everything stopped. Everything stopped. All the physical symptoms and the things.
It's amazing.
So this
there's
was something
something
that that it was self-inflicted, but in her like dream state, this was actually happening to her own body. Did you figure it out for the her kid as well? How was that happening?
it just stopped for both of them. What I think happened is I think that I believe we are linked. I really do. I believe that we're linked to one another. And I believe if you're sensitive, you sometimes don't realize what you're tuning into or picking up on when you're in proximity to someone. And if you have a child, there's always one that's very empathic, very open, the feeler, right? The one that feels deeply and like a sponge. He was that in that family. He was the so I
Yeah.
think, and
Wow.
Carl Jung had this statement of like, children will live out the unlived aspects of their parents, including their burdens and their baggage and their things.
Oof,
So
deep.
it's not as daunting
That's
as
deep.
as it sounds.
Oh,
Or to say, hey, you get to actually do some of the work here and break these patterns and ancestral things that maybe your parents didn't know how to do, weren't prepared to do, didn't have the capacity to understand. I really think he was processing with her and sometimes for her.
oof.
And
Wow.
that to me, like, and maybe there's more, right? And I want to also say, I only know what I know. And it's possible that there was maybe more things also involved in these deep, intricate layers of that situation. But it shifted things for me. And it really came back to the first thing I said, which was whether demons are real or not. I can't answer that question. It's not something I certainly play around with or any of that. But if a client believes something, healing often happens if they have somebody to believe it with, not enabling them, not saying like, not enabling or affirming delusions or anything like that. But if we can just listen to them first, initially with an open heart to say, this person really believes this. Who am I to say that's not real? Because even if it's not grounded in this physical reality outside of us, it is constellated within their psyche, which means they're reacting to that. And their psyche, if we want to believe that this part of us is self-regulating, which it is, it's always trying to bring us back to balance. Who knows that her process of coming back into balance wasn't the bruises, the scratches, wasn't this bizarre thing that we sometimes want to be like, no, that's scary. That's weird. And it's like, well, it's weird if we stay on the surface. If we sink beneath the surface and we realize body is also, many believe, unconsciously reflecting some of our deeper impulses, feelings, sensations. It's why somatic work is so powerful, right? We can unlock muscle memory and things in our tissues and in our muscles. And we don't know what the body's holding, just like we don't know what the shadow is holding, but they're parallel and they mimic each other. So to me, it makes perfect sense spiritually and psychologically that there's some other force at play. But I think of that force as a higher power force and a psychological force together. That's like the soulfulness that's creating these things to unwind them in a way that the logical mind is just like, no, that's not acceptable. Like the ego
Yeah.
is going like, no, that's weird. But
Yeah.
is it? Maybe it's
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
a beautiful part of her story that she needed. I don't know.
So I have just a couple random questions, and I know we have to wrap up and schedule the part 2 because you have so much to tell us. But
Yeah.
one, what you're talking about referring to the mom and then the child taking on, right? Is that part of what people might call generational trauma?
Yeah, I think it can
Okay.
be. Sure. Yeah. I
Okay.
think some of it's inherited emotionally, some of it psychologically, some of it intuitively.
It's just one more reason to add to my list of why I don't want children. So thanks so much for that.
I
Love that instant birth control. Woo! I don't need any of my trauma being lived out. I'm like, I'll keep my trauma. I'll keep my trauma to myself.
The other thing I was going to ask you, oh my gosh, I forgot, and I know it was important. So we take the psychological hat off and we just ask you, just on your own, do you believe demons exist or entities exist, or, that there are other forces that can impact humans outside of just what is going on with us psychologically and spiritually inside?
I do believe it's so hard for me to separate it in my mind.
I know. I knew it would be.
I love
Yay!
it. I love
That's why
this.
I asked.
No, this is good. This is good. Intuitively feel like they're almost the same manifestations. Like Like, for example, what is a demon to one person is a negative thought to another. What is a monstrous action for one person is a literalized fantasy of another. So I guess what I'm trying to say is intuitively not denying the existence of these forces or energies. I do think they're energy, but similar to a thought, I think we feed these things with our attention, with our belief, with our power to them, just like she fed this fear and the body kind of was helping to take it on. It just grew and it grew and it grew. So if we were to just look at that spiritually, it'd be like, well, this force, this uncontrollable force was growing and gaining power over her. And, some might even say she was possessed by that. But in psychology, we also believe in possession. It's just, we might call it neurosis, being possessed by a part of us that's split off, that has its own autonomous way of operating and sometimes works against us. So I don't know that they're fully separate. And I also don't know that they're the same. So it's hard to answer, but intuitively, I want to say yes and yes. I want to say I do believe there's things.
And how very politically answered. Yes, and yes.
Right? Yes and yes.
I mean, there's validity to the phrase, facing your demons. Like, there's a reason we use that terminology, and there must be some understanding. And I loved watching you come to your conclusion on that, because that's exactly what we're doing here, and what we love about talking with you is that you have both experiences and education and knowledge, and you merge them in a way where I'm so glad, Lori, you asked that, because belief does play a role, experience, and vice versa.
There's another thing that just popped in that might be helpful also. This is where the territory also crosses a little bit between spiritual, psychological, and a little bit of like shamanism. I do believe so in the Jungian world, the unconscious also has this really deep part of it that's connected to other people. And in the unconscious is where we experience myth and stories and these archetypal patterns, they call them. So for example, if I were to say the word mother, we all may have different mothers, different cultures, different experiences of mother, but ultimately we kind of understand what I mean by that without having to really, but individually, it's like some of us have maybe had a beautiful, loving, wonderful mother. Somebody else may have had what we call the devouring mother. It was like a total witch, right? But not a fun witch, but like a hateful, angry witch. Yeah. And then there's all different types of mothers. Archetypally, we call this archetypal. A demon archetypally, it would exist in the unconscious, and it would be the forces, the deeper forces within us and in the collective, which is the part of us that's, so there we have so there's also deep layers to the unconscious. We have so when I was talking about the ego, and you get past the ego, you get into this part of the true self. Part of the true self is above the threshold of what we are aware of in consciousness. And part of the self is underneath. So it's almost like that's why we can know parts of us and not know others. It's kind of that thing. When you go deeper and you get really into shadow in the unconscious, then we also have a shared collective unconscious we tap into. That's where those archetypal things come in. But for example, people that don't have and this is just the psychology part of it, and it ties into shamanism too. People that don't have a healthy, strong ego, they will be very fragile in that sense. They will actually be more susceptible to neurosis and these unconscious forces. So someone that has been through a lot of trauma, someone that has not had certain reflections in their life, like mothering or different things that reflected their existence, that validated that they matter, they're important. They didn't receive that type of reflection. The ego can be really fragile. And then what happens is it's almost like it kind of descends into the self a little bit, and that makes it closer to this unconscious part. So these are the people that often will do things we can't understand. Like, we all have had a fantasy about someone we don't like, and maybe some of us maybe imagine wringing their neck or punching
Liz
them
imagines that all the time. I know that's her
all the
thing
time.
for sure. Anyway,
Like, I know somebody like that.
she's like, intuitively, you two bitches, I know, are like that.
I'll take ownership of that full on.
Right?
And everybody, you know who you are, okay? You know who you are.
Exactly. And there's like consciousness or this conscience that says, I want to wring their neck, but I'm not going to because consequences, right? But somebody with a fragile ego that's been consumed by their reality in a sense where they don't feel they matter. They may not be operating with full cognition of their brain. They might have a lot of trauma. They're actually more susceptible to the unconscious, and the unconscious has creative and destructive forces. So I do think there's some crossover with mythology, with demons and angels, and with I call them our afflictions and our compulsions. This is why I believe too, when we see someone who's in the grip of a really bad addiction, or we can see it's almost like they're no longer there, like what's behind their eyes? Something's behind their eyes. They're dark. It's not them. Something else is there. I think we sometimes mistake demonic energy for primal energy. The cutthroat, dismembering, murderous, deep parts of the psyche that are operating from that limbic part of survival. And think about it. If you were a wounded animal and your back's in the corner, at some point your teeth are going to come out. Like you're going to. And so there's some people that trauma and compounding trauma and all these different things, they're reacting. They're completely reacting. They're in touch with those forces. And we look at them and go, that person's a monster.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
There's so much there.
Honestly, I was like, I have to cut this off because I will dive into this for another 3 hours. And I know already that Lori and I want to go, like, that's a perfect segue. So all of you, haha, tease, cliffhanger, we want to go deep dive into murderers, true crime fans. Stay tuned because this is where that shit gets real deep and real good. Let's talk about like human demons. We're going to do it. It's going to be a thing. Put your big girl pants on because it's happening. Come put your headphones on so that your boss doesn't know what you're listening to. And we're going to fuck some shit up because I have to know. I have to know.
I love that. Perfect.
Amazing. Melissa, this has been so fun.
Oh my God, so good.
I don't want to let you leave. I don't want to let you leave, but we have to.
Like sleepover.
Bloody Mary. Okay. Now I want a Bloody Mary. Me. I know. Now I want to drink. So this has been so fun. So everybody who's listening, come back for part 2 because we're going to get into some real cool shit. Melissa Kim Corter, fantastic, amazing, super gifted. Book some sessions with her ass because I'm going to, and I think you're going to be really busy with me and my husband, probably.
Hey, wait, and me, anyway.
And Lori. We're all just going to come together and we're going to do
family
have
sesh.
Bloody Marys, call Bloody Mary, talk about murderers. It's going to be a time. Yeah, but we can't wait for more. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. My pleasure. So much fun. You guys are great. This was a really great time. And I just am so grateful to be able to talk about this because I think it also helps us to find some meaning in these really difficult, ugly things that can actually be creative, if we learn how to explore them in safe ways and fun ways.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
We'll see you next time, bitches.